Welcome back to GreenFin 24 live stream. We're excited to have you here today. We had quite an exciting day yesterday, and we're looking forward to a really great main stage presentation today. We're going to kick it off with Tom Steyer, former presidential candidate, who's going to be interviewed by Sarah Golden, typically my live stream co-host. And then we're going to bring up Tom Chi to talk about deep tech, which I guess is like nascent tech that's going to transform the world. We'll find out from Tom. And one of our favorite things to do at all of our events is our emerging leaders cohort. So we've brought 10 people of color to GreenFin to mingle with people, you know, maybe network to get a job, maybe just to learn more about the sustainability and green finance space. So very excited about having that. Let's see what else we've got going on today. We've got Teresa Lieb, who's going to be interviewing some folks around nature as an investable infrastructure. So Teresa leads our nature and biodiversity group here at Greenbiz, and she's very excited about our next event following GreenFin, which will be Bloom, held in Cali, Colombia, aside next to the UN COP for Nature. So that's coming up in October, along with our Verge event that will be in San Jose at the same time. So very excited to see who Teresa's bringing to the stage today. And then we're going to round out the rest of the day with Mindy Luber from Ceres, and she's going to talk about a new era of corporate climate disclosure. So very exciting day, and then we'll have some afternoon sessions we're going to be going to, but you know, we've got a big announcement. You can hear that.
As a courtesy to our presenters and your fellow attendees, please silence all electronic devices. Thank you.
Can they hear that? I hope so. Anyway, so let's see. What did we have yesterday? We had a lot of good sessions. I attended one around valuing water. That was really good. I think that's one of the places where there's a lot of impact from climate change, and people are starting to realize that they really need to assign a value to water, a financial value to water. And so that was one of the good sessions I went to. I also went to a session around disruptors and you know what's happening today in terms of corporate reporting, in terms of finance. And there were some really interesting folks there. There was one that is financing a debit card that gives you cash back for green purchases, or if you take the metro here in New York. So yeah, looking forward to some more great breakout sessions, but our main stage is what's going to be happening for the next hour, and I'm glad to have you all here to join us. We'll have Grant coming out in just a minute. And let me see what else we got going on. Yeah, got some big little talks coming up. And Monique Allen for the Investment Integration Forum. So I guess I'll get my co-host back when we're done with the main stage, and we'll do some interviews. I've got one with the National Pork Board, got one with Deloitte, and I know Sarah's got a few that she's got going on as well. So hang on. We're getting ready to kick off on the main stage in just a few seconds. See you when we get back.
Please welcome to the stage Director, Sustainable Finance and ESG, Grant Harrison.
All right, everybody, welcome to day 2 here at GreenFin 24. So nice to meet so many of you in the hallways and the sessions. Hope you're getting to know each other, strangers or just friends you haven't met yet. Thank you again to our sponsors, especially our foundational sponsor, Deloitte, for making this all possible. And again, to our partners who, as I mentioned yesterday, help us to bring the right folks into the room and to make this event a sustainable one. We are going to kick off today's program digging into how we win the climate war with someone who's been fighting it for quite some time. Please join me in welcoming to the stage our director of our Verge event and VP of Energy, Sarah Golden.
Welcome to the stage, Tom Steyer. I am Sarah Golden. I'm an Executive Director of Verge and VP of Climate Tech at Greenbiz. And I am delighted to be joined here by a man that I have tremendous respect for, who wears many hats. Tom Steyer is a billionaire hedge fund manager, a philanthropist, a climate tech VC, a former presidential candidate, and now also a published author. So Tom, welcome to the GreenFin stage.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start out by talking a little bit about your book, Cheaper, Faster, Better, How We Win the Climate War. Tell me, what is this book about?
Well, I was very interested in writing a book to try and reframe the way we think about the climate crisis and the climate opportunity. And I felt as if in the United States, even though people pushing for decarbonization and pushing for clean energy have all the facts on their side and all the morality on their side, we aren't winning the argument. And I felt like it's really important to rephrase this, because what it's going to take is an all-of-society response. So there has to be a way to talk about this so that people can come together around the idea that solving this problem is not eat your gruel, it's not the world is terrible, it's this is a great opportunity for America and for Americans. And that this is not a sad story. Hopefully this book is pleasant to read, God forbid, actually a book that's fun to read, but also that there's a message in it that is optimistic and hopeful, because I'm optimistic and hopeful. And I think that, I wanted to get away from two ideas. One is, it's a fossil fuel economy and it always will be. That's baloney. And two, we're destroying nature, we're in a doom loop, there's nothing we can do about it, so let's just be depressed together. Also, complete baloney. And so I wrote the book to try and put forward what I see as the truth of what's going on in the world and the truth of how great a chance this is for us as a country.
And thank you for writing it. I admit that I have recently been, I have some to that doom loop myself, and I find this book to be incredibly hopeful and constructive and solutions-oriented. So I appreciate you putting it out there. I wanted to talk about a couple of more points within this book. One is the idea that renewables and climate tech is winning in the market. So could you quickly share what that's about?
Just to give a couple examples, I don't think everybody, assume the people in this audience actually know that renewable energy is the cheapest energy in the world. In 2023, new electricity generation globally, 86% renewable. Why did people around the world do that? Because it's cheaper, faster, and better. No one was doing it to be nice. Everyone was doing it because it's a better deal for them, and that's what we have to accept, is that's the world we live in. People are making self-interested choices, and we have to make sure that they make good self-interested choices. I would say when we look at multiple industries, multiple opportunities, what we're seeing in electricity, we're seeing around the world. So as somebody who spends his time as an investor looking at business-related questions about what's going to work and what's going to succeed, we are winning very substantially across the board. And the things that need to get done are being approached. And I'm a big believer that in terms of the technologies, we're going to win. No question. So I feel as if when we look at this, we have to accept that it's not that we're going to win, we are winning. We are going to win. The question is how fast.
So I would love to stay at this point a little bit. For the last several years, I have also been sharing this point about, well, the levelized cost of energy is lower when it comes to renewable than any form of fossil fuels. And you just cited that figure, 87% of new generation last year being renewable. I believe about 80% of that is in China, which is also not a capitalistic system. They aren't working on the same playbook that we are here in America. And I've been seeing this equation be a bit complicated recently. And there's also a book that recently came out about the same time as yours that is making the rounds right now, which is actually called The Price is Wrong, which is by Brett Christophers. And I'm not going to stay on this book long, but the point that he's making is that it's not about price comparison of the technologies, it's about profits. And what we've been seeing is that it's been harder to make profits in renewables, and as a result, there's been sort of a pullback on some of these plans. And this idea that people don't invest in a solar farm because it's the cheapest form of generation. They invest or don't invest based on whether it's profitable. And so we've seen some of this reflected. I've seen the IOCs, and I've seen oil companies, and I've seen different companies that have made clean energy commitments and renewable commitments in the last few years pull back some on those commitments, and in many cases with the insistence from shareholders that are wanting to see a larger return. And I don't think they're doing this because they love oil. I think they're doing this because they love money. And so I'm curious how you square this moment that we're at and sort of this complication around profits and what that means for renewables.
So I'll make 3 quick points. One is, in a commodity business, you make more money if your costs are lower, period. So if you think about it, the way commodities work, it goes to a market clearing price, and basically it's the marginal cost of that commodity. So if we can produce solar and wind much cheaper than oil and gas, which we can, and that advantage will increase, and we can sell it at the same price, then it should be a lot more profitable. So that's the first point. We're talking about electricity, and there is so much more to decarbonization than just electricity, which is what we tend to think about. But let's stay on that topic for now. The second point is, there is a difference between baseload power and intermittent power. And so when we think about why people claim they need fossil fuels, it's all about, we absolutely need this really high concentration of baseload power, because otherwise we're going to have days when it's cloudy, days when the wind doesn't blow, and therefore we're going to be at risk, and we need 24/7, 365 energy. So that's the second question, as if the only way we could get baseload power is from fossil fuels. Not true. But the third point is this. You can borrow really, really cheaply on fossil fuel projects. It's kind of like, it's plug and play. The banks have done this for 100 years. They can look at a project and know, when we do it, this is what it's going to cost, this is how it's going to work. When we're done, you're going to turn it, the turbines are going to be spinning. We don't have to worry about it, it's plug and play. And as a result, the borrowing costs in there are much, much lower, and the amount of money is much, much higher, just because they've had 100 years to look at it, and they've got thousands of, comps to put in their spreadsheets. Let me say, I think that is insane. Because looking back over the last 100 years about energy and projecting that for the next 100 years, it literally can't happen, because the implication there is that the forcing function is economic. That in fact, we need a certain amount of electricity, we have to get it, and therefore, however we get it, that's the forcing function in terms of what's the right thing to do and what's economic. And I would argue, no, that's not true. Because the forcing function is going to be what happens to the rest of the world. The idea that we can continue on this treadmill as if nothing else was happening besides economics is wholly false. We're seeing it today in New York City. We're seeing it throughout the United States. We saw it last week in Florida. We're seeing it, I was getting the numbers of what the temperature was in Mecca yesterday, 122 degrees. The forcing function is human life, human health, and also, if I may say so, the dramatic hit to human economic welfare that we're going to see from destroying the natural world.
It's an interesting point how much we're operating in a system that was created for a different type of energy source, just how much that's actually needing to be transformed as well. And that point that you made around we are going to be reducing fossil fuels, that we will be able to get off of fossil fuels eventually.
No, not eventually. We definitely can get off fossil fuels much faster than people understand.
Perfect, yes. And in that, one of the complications I've been seeing, because for the last few years, this has been, for the last 10 years as I've been in this industry, this is what I've been saying. We have a better source of energy, and this will take the place, and it must take the place. And there's been this complication we've seen in the last couple of years, which is the insatiable demand for energy of AI. And this, for me, makes me really worried, because it's no longer as though there's ever going to be a limit where we say, okay, that's enough energy. And so my concern is as we put more renewables on the grid, that there will still be an incentive to continue to run fossil fuels to meet this demand for AI and this global race we have for AI right now. So if we increase the efficiency within a data center twofold, I don't think that's going to mean it's going to use half the amount of energy. I worry that's going to mean we're just going to do twice the amount of computing. So how do we get off of fossil fuels when we want energy?
Sarah, that is a real challenge, and I'm sure everybody in this room has thought about this, but I happen to live in Northern California, which I think is kind of the center of AI. And so I'm very aware from people in my life how intense that competition is. That there's, a dramatic, intense pressure to win in this race. And so if you think about it, I think to put Sarah's argument into numbers simply, if you assume that there are 100 units of electricity needed, it was growing really, really slowly. And therefore, if we produced 10 units of clean electricity, most of them, 8 of them, 9 of them would go to reduce fossil fuel electricity. So as a result, we were not just creating clean, we were reducing dirty. But if in fact every year electricity has a need for 10% more, then what that means is if we produce 10 units of electricity, it all goes to the new electricity and we don't retire fossil fuel plants. That's really what that is really the challenge here. And so there's going to be a huge challenge in terms of producing clean energy that is different and more intense than we'd expected. Absolutely, and since I live in Northern California, I can tell you that the people who are serious about this competition are deadly serious about it. People think people in NorCal are kind of low-key. Not so much. You don't build the biggest industries in the world being low-key, and they're not low-key about this. Having said which, we really do live in the real world. We live in the natural world. Watching the natural, we cannot afford to lose this fight. And the fact that there's an additional hurdle is, it's an additional hurdle, but it's by no means the end of the world. And let me say this, if you look at the numbers globally about how this is going to work out, just to put it in context for one sec, the United States is 11% of emissions, something like that. We've said we'll get it down in half over the next decade, something like that. This is shades of gray in the world. Last year, the United States went down 4%, Europe went down 4%, China went up 5%, India went up 7%, emissions in the world went up 1.1%. So even if we meet our goals, which I believe we will, and it may be difficult, but I believe we will, this outcome is going to be written in what we would think of very populous, somewhat developing world countries. So it would be India, China, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, and then Africa. But the near-in places are those Asian places because they're developing electricity and they're building up so fast. So when we think about that, it is going to be really important. And just as an example, Vietnam had 0 renewables in 2018. They now have a higher percentage of renewables than we do. People are absolutely building this. So when we think about how this is going to go, let's not over-focus on the United States because we live in the United States. This is global warming. It requires a global solution. The answers are not going to be written in terms of where the emissions happen. in the 50 states of the United States.
So quickly, we only have about a minute left. One of the things I've heard you talk about is that this is inevitable, and then also that bankers, investors need to make the right decisions. So how can we ensure that people are actually making these decisions to do this in a time frame necessary?
So I think the issue that we have is, I think everybody making decisions now knows the facts. I don't think anybody's a real denier. Some people may deny for political reasons or to help their careers, but nobody's fooled. Everybody can see the facts on the ground every day. The question is, are they going to be responsible personally? So let me say this. Looking around, I know there's some people in this audience who are old enough to have gone through the mortgage meltdown. Now, did the people who were writing those mortgages that basically took this economy and trashed it know that they were writing bad mortgages? Yes. They absolutely knew. Did they think that they were going to be held responsible, or did they think that they were going to get a big old bonus at the end of the year? They thought they were going to get a big old bonus at the end of the year, and to heck with everything else. So when we look at what's going on in terms of energy, the people who are making the argument politically, the people who are making the loans, they think, yeah, it may happen, but not on my watch. I know what the impacts are going to be, but not on my watch. I'm not going to pay. Now that thinking, I describe in it from an investment standpoint, catch a falling knife. Like, it's going to be okay. I can catch this knife and somebody else will get cut. I will say in history that has never worked. You know, you think you're going to be so smart, you're going to time it. I think if you look at the mortgage market, you know, didn't exactly work out. It's almost, you look at those investments and you say, how is it possible that we can keep emitting at that level for the time period over which that asset, the asset life is expected to be? Can't. Do I think the people making the loans and the investments know that? Yes. Do they think they're going to pay personally? No. That's our issue. And that's something where it's really important that people making those decisions, that people observing that, come into the real world about where we are and what the true forcing function is going to be. The true forcing function is going to be avoiding human suffering, having an economy that works, not having people, having the ability to have home mortgages in the United States. There are so many different things that are going to bring this home in a powerful way to human beings, and it's not just floods and fires and heat-related death. It's also going to be America's savings. Basically, our savings accounts are our houses. If you can't get a home insurance, you can't get a mortgage. If somebody can't get a mortgage, they can't buy your house. Americans are going to notice that.
Tom Steyer, thank you so much for being here.
Nice to see you all.
Please join me in thanking Tom Steyer. Thank you for writing this book. It's such a pleasure. I would like to continue our all-star Tom lineup and invite out to the stage Tom Chi, who is a founding partner at One Venture Capital. At One Ventures, I'm so sorry. Tom, please come out.
I got to do this for our press person. Okay, great. Doing the thing. Where's those slides? Oh, that's just me. What's that about? Okay, so we're talking about the climate transition and the role of disruptive deep tech, but let's start by just talking about how things are going so far. So in 2022, WWF released a study that actually took about 50 years to go do, where they were tracking the progress of 32,000 wildlife populations spanning 5,000 different species that are kind of hallmarks of what was happening in those ecosystems and how those organisms, of course, in particular, were doing. And what they found out is that, on average, there was a 70% decline, 69%, decline in the actual amount of organisms of those species. Some were hit a lot worse. There are some parts of the world that were more than 90%, some parts obviously a little bit less than 70%, but to be very crisp, like we oftentimes talk about extinction as the main damaging thing that we can do to nature. We're emptying out nature. You know, this is basically saying 70% of these organisms have, in terms of population count, are gone now, right? And we can't do that again. If in the next 50 years we wipe out a similar amount, we're just kind of out of nature at that point. Beyond that, we've just had over a year and a half of the hottest ocean temperatures ever recorded in modern history. And what this is driving is mass coral bleaching and death. So it's estimated that in this past year and a half, we have lost somewhere between 35 to 50% of all coral coverage on planet Earth. And we're basically on trajectory to extinct coral reefs from planet Earth by around the year 2055. Now, as soon as we do that, we instantly wipe out 25% of all marine species. In addition, there's about 10 to 15%, even though they don't live on the reef directly, their food chain or the reproduction chain depends on the reef. So we will directly extinct that 25%. We might extinct an additional 10 to 15% beyond those species just by the kind of related effects of getting rid of that ecosystem from planet Earth. And this is the legacy, right? Like, you know, when you know, some of you guys are already at that point in life, some of you guys, actually the young delegates are right in front, right? The young delegates, like, someday when you're talking to your grandkids about this will be the century where we either completely lost nature on planet Earth or we didn't. And if we ended the century and we had gotten to the right temperature for planet Earth, but we had emptied it out of all interesting biodiversity and life, I think we've failed pretty horribly. Right now, we're actually not on track to achieve either of the things, but it doesn't mean that we can't change course. There's plenty of time to go do it. I think we just have to be real about where it is right now. Now, let's get into the money, because this is obviously a finance conference, but this is from the Climate Tech VC folks that rebranded as Sightline. And you'll note that in terms of where Climate Tech VC has put its money, the largest bar by a lot is transportation. And that was about 53% of all the capital that went into climate tech. Now, that was speaking to allegedly 15% of the emissions pie. In practice, most of that went to light vehicles that represent less than half of that 15%. So it means that 53% of all the money that we've put into climate has gone to address about 7%, plausibly address 7% of the problem. We haven't addressed it yet. This is basically all the money shooting for 7%, and we're not going to get all 7%. And when you do that math, you're like, maybe we're allocating this pretty poorly, actually, right? Like there is something about this which is actually not driving an obviously efficient market. This is massively imbalanced relative to what actually needs to happen. So, and actually, as Tom Steyer basically said, in the session right before this, that of the things in energy, we're really focused on electricity. The phrase is being used a lot, the hard to decarbonize sectors. Those are the places where we basically aren't putting as much money, aren't making as much progress, and it is same order of magnitude. Basically, it's like 22% of emissions compared to electricity generation's 25% of emissions. It's basically the same thing. Also, food and agriculture is 26% of emissions, right? We're basically failing really badly at these things that are as big as electricity generation and not really looking at them. Now, this is where the kind of purpose of deep tech comes in, because we call those things hard to decarbonize because we have not figured out how to decarbonize them yet. And it means that there's a knowledge gap that we need to work out, an innovation gap that needs to be worked out, and that is where the role of deep tech comes in. Now, when people talk about advanced technology today, a lot of the thought, just given the recent work that's been coming out of the tech world in Silicon Valley, so it's kind of my fault as much as anybody else's fault, is that, oh, well, it's going to be some kind of AI software-y type thing. No, I'm sorry, right? This entire software will eat the world idea, it's actually useless relative to this work, right? If you go to a steel plant, you're not going to find a line of code running on the plant, Maybe there'll be a line of code in a PLC, in the firmware. But that's not really what people mean by software is going to eat the world. So what line of code are you going to change that's going to decarbonize that steel plant? And yet we see a bunch of companies starting that's like, oh, well, it's enterprise SaaS, guys. It's got to be software. That's the stuff that gets funded. Now, getting funded is not the same thing as solving the problem. I think it's very simple, right? The problem looks more like this. And I'm seeing way fewer deals in terms of these hard to decarbonize sectors: steel, aluminum, cement, glass, paper, right? These things are not even being talked about, but widely talked about, but those sorts of things are the physical materials that we make the modern world out of. And unless we're just deciding not to use those anymore at all, then we've got to go work out the deep tech that allows us to actually innovate the production process and change how these things are made foundationally. And I run a venture firm. All we do is the hard to decarbonize sectors. We have one software investment out of 41 investments. Everything else is physical, manufacturing, the changing of the core industries that need to change to be able to go address this. And what does addressing it actually look like? I think there's a really important point that we've recently learned from some of the successes that we've had. So the Montreal Protocol passed in 1987, and in about 9 years, it completely eliminated CFCs from the developed world. They gave the developing world an additional 15 years, but by 2010, effectively no more CFCs from the developing world either. And what you're seeing is, great, we actually stopped the massive decline. It finally kind of bottomed out. But the actual repair of nature takes some time. Now, luckily, we made the choice in 1987 because it means by about 2060, the ozone layer will be back to health. We'll be back to the health that it was 100 years prior. But all these things that we're talking about in terms of, we got to decarbonize, this is just it's still on the downslope part of it, right? Even if we were successful in all the goals that all the people in this room are after, this is us just stopping the thing so we bottom out. And I think we need to realize that the time it takes for the ice caps just to refreeze, even if I could snap my fingers and everything was actually just magically solved this second, that would still be another 70 to 100 years for the cryosphere to stabilize. I mean, I think we're very much misunderstanding time. I think we're very much misunderstanding that we are living in a physical world and that financial abstractions don't magically change the physical world. I'm a physicist by training. The physical world actually trumps every possible thing that you can imagine in the economic world, and then we pretend that it doesn't. We play these local games that are not the real game that is actually happening. Well, this year is the year that the most coral that will ever die is going to die. Because after we lose, 40, 50% this year, then it'll be on a smaller base. So sure, if we lose 50% of that base, then yeah, that's a massive loss, but still a way smaller area. And yet we are not even talking about this particular thing. So I think it's really important to get in our minds that this is what the actual task looks like. This is a multi-100-year project where we have the most important thing to do right now in the next 50 years so that this bottoms out and the curve actually arrives back at a repair. But the depth of the work is really profound and much deeper than the conversations that I've been hearing. Now, I'll end on something I think is provocative, but also just really interesting, drives a bunch of questions. So over on the left-hand side, you see a schematic of the Occidental Petroleum Direct Air Capture Plant, which doesn't exist yet, but they're talking about breaking ground sometime in the next year or so, estimated to cost between $2 to $3 billion to construct. And their claim to fame is that, once this is actually in operations, it's going to be sequestering 100 times more than all 19 existing direct air capture plants on planet Earth combined. Now that sounds like that would be a big deal, but according to my calculations, then that plant over its lifetime is going to sequester roughly the same amount of carbon as 200 beavers. Now, you guys are like, the hell? What are beavers doing? Well, here's what beavers do. So what happens is when you put a dam into a stream system, a river system, all that sort of thing, it actually becomes a sediment trap for the entire watershed that is leading up to it. So imagine a huge land area where there's organic matter and all these sorts of regular activities happening. And as things die and break off and that sort of thing, there's little bits of organic matter and sediment that are coming down the stream. Now, normally, in the absence of a dam, it just keeps on rolling. And if it has a long enough residency time in the water, it will go decay. The organic material in the water will decay back to carbon dioxide or methane. Now, if it hits a beaver dam, what happens is it settles at the bottom, and then sediment covers it. As soon as the sediment covers it, instead of decaying in the presence of oxygen, it decays anoxically. And because it decays anoxically, it cannot become CO2. There's no oxygen available for that to be the case. So the carbon actually stays trapped in the soils. And we see this because wetland soils are called histosols. And histosols basically have 10, 20, 30x the carbon carrying capacity of regular soils that you might walk on a farmland or in your yard, right? And actually, we know how carbon concentrating these sorts of environments are because most of our current oil and gas deposits used to be wetlands. This is the process that concentrates carbon in nature incredibly, and as opposed to this plant over here, which uses a huge percentage of its balance of plant on the energy just to suck the air through so that they can spend more energy on sorbing, desorbing, so that et cetera, right? Instead of this, the beaver, the energy for that just comes from the gravity in the watershed. All the raw materials come to it. And basically, it just does its one action. Also, labor-wise, these are very inexpensive to employ. I was trying to go calculate this, but this is, over on the left, that's us basically paying 1,000,000x too much per ton. And this shows to me how big the disconnect is in terms of where our vision is, in terms of where we even decide to look. The kinds of things, because this thing on the left is highly financeable. I think that's a really tough question for all these finance people in the room, right? Why is this financeable at 2 to 3 billion, and why is that not financeable? Why are the beavers not financeable? It's because we don't know how to financially enclose them. And as much as we talk about efficient markets, the truth is the things that are easily traded and enclosed, those are the things that we prefer, right? Those are the things that succeed in markets. And the things that are not easily enclosed, because, how do you financially enclose a beaver? I don't know. Then those are the things that are not tradable, even if they're literally 1,000,000 times better, right? So this, to me, is a provocation on a bunch of things that are broken, and I think I could have a 10-hour lecture just on what this implies about the decisions that we've made and the game that we've chosen to play, but it's certainly the wrong game. And ultimately, we're going to need the actual solve. The actual solve will come, especially in the industries that we care to keep, will come through real technical innovation, real depth of work that allows us to go transform how those foundationally work, not just play economic games on how things are accounted. So thank you. Should I do a thing? Okay.
One of the most frequent questions I get is how should businesses handle this hyper-political environment, especially when it comes to ESG? Well, one place to start is by asking this question. Is your business putting its mouth where its political money is already going? And that raises two big picture questions. I want to offer you two big picture answers that can be tailored for any business. First and foremost, should you be giving at all? Here you can look to the ERB, that's ERB, Institute's Principles for Corporate Political Responsibility, and those principles can help you analyze whether political activities are in your shareholders' best interests. Second, if your answer to the first question is yes, well then how much do you give and where? Well, here your firm can adopt the CPA-Zicklin Model Code of Conduct for corporate political spending, and that will take you step by step through this analysis. It's critical to get a handle on this rising risk, and it's critical to trace your own money trail before, as we've seen time and again, someone else does it for you. I am Allison Heron Lee, and that's my Big Little Talk.
Public funding from the Global Environment Facility is supporting business at all scales to be more resilient to the effects of climate change and to be more competitive in an increasingly regulated space. But public funding can only go so far. We need a global reach of business and investment community to back solutions for sustainable development and inform the international policy environments that will be essential to a livable planet. Because a dead planet is not part of our pension fund. I'm Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, and this is my big little talk.
Coined in 2015, system-level investing has been termed the next frontier for finance. Put simply, if systemic risks such as today's complex global challenges like climate change, racial inequity, and income inequality differ from idiosyncratic risks, then the tools needed to manage and address them must also differ to contend with them. While impact and sustainable and system-level investors aim for alpha or strong financial performance through investments that measurably contribute to social, environmental, and governance progress, system-level investors play a unique role. They intentionally consider the health of the beta, or the context in which we all operate, adopting policies and practices to manage systemic risks and rewards. TIP connects systems thinking with investing through our research, and our consulting practice assists would-be system-level investors in making that transition. Launched in 2023 to subscribers, our SaaS platform, the Systems Aware Investing Launchpad, serves as a user-friendly, accessible, one-stop shop for investors seeking to learn about and adopt system-level investing at their own pace. Ultimately, we aim for more investors to become system-level investors so that we protect the people and ecosystems that investors rely on for long-term returns. I'm Monique Aiken, Managing Director at TIP, the Investment Integration Project, and this is my big little talk.
Welcome Greenbiz CEO Eric Farrow to the stage.
Hello. Before I get my little 2-minute commercial in about Greenbiz and we go to the emerging leaders, I want to give a quick shout out to Grant for convening such an awesome group of people. Let's hear it for Grant. So at Greenbiz, we empower professional communities to confront the climate crisis. And how we do this is really helping you learn, connect, and engage through our events like this, digital media, and our peer network. And we like to think of it as a flywheel that's really accelerating the impact you can have in this transition that we need to have to confront the climate crisis. And the way we look through basically the lens of corporate sustainability. That's been where we've been in the center of gravity for 18 years. I know it's a long time, but I will say, for some of you in the audience, Joel McCower, who's one of the co-founders of Greenbiz, has been doing this longer than you have been alive. So a long time, and these ecosystems, is how we think about them, are surround the corporate sustainability world. And so sustainable finance is one of those. Nature, circular economy. And this is actually the framework that we have for our Trellis network, which is the peer network that I mentioned earlier. We have an analyst that leads each of these categories, and there's groups of people that are clustered around those spaces. And Grant is going to be getting our sustainable finance one off the ground right after this event. And at the bottom, you'll see just transition. And that's what the Emerging Leaders is all about. Essentially, this is our opportunity to get it right, and our commitment to that is greenbiz.org. And Brian Lewis does an incredible job running that for us. And I'm going to bring him on stage to introduce this year's Emerging Leaders. Brian.
What's going on, everybody? Nah, that's too weak, that's too weak, that's too weak. What's going on, everybody? All right, all right, all right. One of the favorite parts about my job, as Eric just mentioned, is that I get to come on stage and just gloat about how much I love the Emerging Leaders program, and the work that we do with Just Transition at greenbiz.org. So for those of you who don't know, our Emerging Leaders program grows and cultivates the next generation of sustainable professionals of color. And since 2017, which is how long the program's been active, we've curated a community of over 300 amazing young professionals of color who are actively changing the world in which we live. Now, this Emerging Leaders program helps to support emerging leaders of color by giving them opportunities to come to Greenbiz conferences, to get free passes to Greenbiz events, to get their flights covered, to get their hotels covered, and to have exclusive networking opportunities at each one of our events. But it doesn't just stop there. We curate a network of emerging leaders. I mentioned we have 300 of them. Emerging leaders that we put into a network where they can then, throughout the rest of their careers, continue to engage, continue to grow, continue to cultivate themselves alongside a peer network that is cultivating along with them. And so I'm so proud to be a part of leading this just transition work forward because, quite frankly, DEI and the work that we're doing is under attack. But that's not the story. That's not the story that we want to communicate because, quite honestly, when we see a challenge, we face it. Okay, so Greenbiz is doubling down and taking that step to support the next generation of young professionals of color to make sure that green finance is diverse and inclusive. So with that being said, I'm so excited to introduce you to this year's GreenFin 24 Emerging Leaders who hail from all across the world. We have a diverse cohort with folks who are just graduating school and even folks who are in their second PhDs. Someone who did a first PhD and was like, you know what, let's do that again, okay? So I'm really excited for you all to meet all of these amazing young individuals, and I'm actually gonna ask them to take a stand. They're actually in this first row right here. Can you all stand up and please, GreenFin, can you give a welcome to our amazing emerging young leaders? I'm so passionate about this program. I don't want to make y'all, yeah, y'all can say it. I don't want it to be awkward. I'm so passionate about this program because it really takes a village to make this whole thing happen. I am but one person, okay? And I lead greenbiz.org. I do the best that I can, but without the efforts of many of the folks in this room and many of the folks backstage, Grant, Eric, many of the operations folks that helps to put this work together, this would not be possible. And one thing that I'm really excited about, I mentioned that we give special networking opportunities and directly connect people with resources and opportunities that help further their careers. Well, at this conference, GreenFin 24, right here, right now, we are going to have an opportunity later today to go visit the stock exchange, the New York Stock Exchange. We're going to visit the trading floor. We might have a chance to ring the bell. So if you are watching CNBC later today, maybe you might see me up there doing a little, you know what I mean? But these are the opportunities that can only come when we get on stage and tell you just how important this work is. So here I am doing that and inviting you to now connect with our emerging leaders. It's so critical that you have an opportunity to talk with each and every one of our emerging leaders. And it's pretty easy to identify them, to be quite honest, because they'll have an emerging leaders pin. It is bright blue, and it's going to be very well placed on their chest or wherever it's going to be for them. And my challenge to each and every one of you is that before we go to the stock exchange around 2:30, from now until 2:30, I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to connect with them. So during lunch, I'm going to challenge you to make a connection with an emerging leader, because that connection can lead to new and vast opportunities and be your way of making an impact towards this just transition. This program is not going anywhere. We're doubling down and we're making sure that we're fostering that next generation of sustainable professionals of color in green finance. We want to make sure that this industry is representative and that we can see ourselves in the future of sustainability and the future of finance. So the last thing that I want to do is, can you put my slide back up? There we go. There's a QR code. I want you to take out your phone. I'm going to give you all 15 seconds right now. Please, please, please. You can take out your phone. You can get your camera ready. You can hit the QR code thing. This will take you directly to greenbiz.org's website. And on greenbiz.org's website, what can you do? Well, you can connect with each and every one of these amazing, emerging, young leaders. It'll take you to their profiles. You can read their bios. You can see their beautiful pictures. You can make a direct connection with them. And then you can click on that link, and it'll take you directly to their LinkedIn or their website. So with that being said, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for supporting the future of the just transition in sustainability. And I thank you for your time. I've been Brian. Please come see me. Talk about this work. Thank you so much, GreenFin 24.
Thank you, dude. Yes. Right on. I will put in another plug for the emerging leaders and another encouragement to take up Brian's challenge to connect with him. I guarantee you will be happy that you did. Next, we're going to move on to nature with our VP of Nature to get into nature as investable infrastructure. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Greenbiz's Teresa Lieb.
We got some fans in the audience. I love it. Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Lieb. I'm the VP of Nature and Europe at Greenbiz, and it's been my pleasure to help lead and grow this really exciting community of practitioners and investors and corporates, corporate sustainability professionals who are trying to incorporate nature and biodiversity into their sustainability strategies. And I'm very glad that Tom came before us because he actually set us up perfectly for this conversation, and he took away the job for me to explain why we need to worry about biodiversity and what the extinction crisis is, and why we should care about beavers. So thank you, Tom, for that great setup. And I'm joined by two excellent speakers today. Nela Duke Ekpengyong is joining us from Lagos in Nigeria today. Nela is a conservationist, a venture capitalist, and really trying to bridge the gap between the nature and climate communities in Nigeria and in many other countries in Africa. So very excited to have you here. Thank you for making the trip. And then Raviv Turner, who's joining from Boulder, Colorado, also a great nature place. Raviv is a founding member of the Nature Tech Collective, which is a really rapidly growing organization at the center of lots of entrepreneurs building nature tech startups and solutions and working to embed them across the corporate sustainability ecosystem. And as I learned yesterday, Raviv is also now managing partner at a brand new venture studio called NatureX, and has a lot of experience as an entrepreneur before going into the nature space. So thank you both for being here today.
Great to be here.
All right, so to kind of continue where Tom has ended his presentation. I think he was a little bit more pessimistic about the state of nature investment than I am, and than you both are, I think, as well. So, and I guess like to maybe take a step back. I think nature and biodiversity for many of us working in the private sector is kind of a new thing, but it's not a new thing for a lot of other people around the world. There have been governments, development banks, lots of conservation organizations trying to do this work for a really long time and trying to finance nature-based solutions, finance conservation programs, finance coming up with markets for ecosystem services. So investing in nature is not new, but it's new for this community. And I think that is an exciting thing, because even though we're not the first ones working on this, I think the private sector can play a really important role in actually scaling those investments, speeding them up, and making sure that we don't just invest in carbon capture plants, but also in beavers. And so, Ravi, if I want to start the conversation with you, can you explain a little bit about why that is happening now? Like, what is different now from the past 30 years of more like philanthropic and public investment in nature? Why is the private sector getting engaged, and what's changing as a result?
Yes, I think what's changing is the elevated risk that we see from nature, and that's transition risk. So risk from regulation and litigation. I'm also part of the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures on the data group. So we've been seeing this kind of building in the system. We have, I think, over 300 companies that already committed to TNFD this year. We have another hundreds of companies that committed to follow TNFD next year. We have SBTN, which is Science-Based Targets for Nature. We have CSRD in effect. In Europe already, we have the UDR for deforestation. So there's elevated transition risk for sure. We're also seeing elevated physical risk, mostly to supply chain, specific industries, pharma, real estate, construction, food and ag, and other industries that's starting to see physical risks from nature. And that's water, soil, biodiversity. That translates into lots of value destruction to those companies between now and 2030. And then last one is systemic risk that spans across the entire system. One example of systemic risk that we've seen here in the US back in 2019 was PE&G that went bankrupt from fires in California and not working with nature and doing some of the vegetation management. And there's plenty, I think, of examples in the markets right now for building physical risks, and that's a ticking time bomb for portfolio managers and asset managers that need to go really deep into understanding nature and the risks that nature presents to their portfolios.
That's a great example of PG&E. Do you have another example from the supply chain perspective? I think that's where I'm seeing a lot of companies investing and getting involved. And how does that risk then translate into opportunity, both like for resilient supply chains, but also for financial opportunity?
Yes. So yeah, there are other examples of that physical risk, post-transition and physical risks. AAK that makes vegetable oil, and I think got sued for sourcing illegal palm oil from Indonesia. Mm-hmm. Or Bernard Matthews in the UK in poultry that had to cull hundreds of thousands of chickens from bird flu. So that risk is building, but also present opportunities. We're seeing companies doing insetting now for nature and really starting to invest in system restoration and restoring ecosystem alongside their supply chain. We're also seeing investors, mostly institutionals and also impact investors, family offices, entering the space and investing mostly in timber and in agriculture. Here in the US, we have some firms such as SLM Partners and Farmland LPs and others that actually now getting into the business of buying degraded land, putting operators, building topsoil, regenerating that land, and seeing double-digit returns from investing in regen agriculture.
Okay, so we're really seeing that mindset shift from nature as a resource that companies can use to nature as infrastructure, critical infrastructure for the future. Nela, that's what brings me to you. You've been, for many years, trying to conserve a really critical piece of nature ecosystems at the border between Nigeria and Cameroon called the Obudu Conservation Area. I think that kind of effort in conserving that land has also changed during that time, and becoming easier now as kind of like this global interest in nature is arriving on the ground, more or less. So can you talk a little bit about what you've been trying to do and how that dynamic is shifting at the moment?
Thank you. So I'm going to start by, and first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure. I'm going to start by, throwing a question to the audience. Indulge me, please. How many of us, just by show of hands, very quickly, how many of us know that gorillas are in Africa? I'm going to switch from beavers to gorillas for a second. Okay, yeah, okay, perfect, good. Now, how many of us have heard of the Cross River gorilla? Therein lies the problem. So thank you. So as Teresa shared, I am a venture capitalist by day, a conservationist by night, and the area that we're working to protect is actually a biodiversity hotspot, of which there are only 35 left in the world. I promise it won't be all doom and gloom. There are only 35 of them left in the world, and what makes them so unique is that if they are lost, they can't be regenerated, and so it's just gone. And in Africa, part of the investing that I'm doing is around climate adaptation, and we've seen that on the continent. Harvard released a paper that out of the 20 most affected countries of climate change, 17 of them are in Africa. But we are definitely not responsible for the climate crisis or a vast majority of those emissions, right? So that we're disproportionately affected. And what we've seen on ground when looking at, some of the challenges and perhaps the risks that accompany them are, twofold. One being financial, and dealing with nature recovery. A lot of the capital historically has come in from the global north. And there's no issue with that, nor is there particularly an issue with the effectiveness of the mechanisms that are used in nature investing for offsetting, for carbon offsetting. Where the crisis really lies is actually in the human rights violations that can occur. And how that happens is not without the involvement of the local communities at large. And what we've seen is that if those communities aren't involved, so it's very much top-down when looking at conservation, especially in Africa. And so if those local communities aren't involved from the get-go, what happens is that, one, it's not sustainable, nothing actually takes place, and then two, you have this neo-colonialism that can happen around biodiversity credits and corporates, right? So we are working closely with a lot of organizations to combat that. We're also working very heavily with women in the community. I can't stress enough how important women are at the local level in Africa. Our populations are growing very rapidly. They're about, women in Nigeria at least have about 5 children per woman. I myself have 3, so I joke with my husband, 2 more and we're there. He doesn't find it funny. But it's really the stakeholder involvement is what we're working on, yeah.
And do you have any examples from your own work in the Buru region around, how are you trying to do that right, or better, at least?
Yeah, so we work with NCF, and one of the projects that has been done is we have a nature reserve called the Becheve Nature Reserve, and so we have about a third of Nigeria's forest, and it goes into Cameroon, and there we have we're using the biodiversity credits, but working with the local community. So the local community are used as stakeholders, and they guard they do the safeguarding, but more importantly, the profits, 60% of the profits go to the local community, which then gets filtered down to education, healthcare, and sustainable livelihoods. So there's a need for them to be recognized for their importance to the global economy.
And then how do you, see the dynamics shifting now that there's a lot of investors, startups really trying to get engaged in nature conservation? Do you see a lot of private capital coming into Nigeria, trying to support these sorts of projects, the work that you do as well? Mm-hmm. Or is it still too early?
I wouldn't say it's still too early. Yeah. We're just at the cusp. Right, and what is incredible about the work we're doing, so my firm, my family office, we're actually, I think someone mentioned this yesterday, that in emerging markets, the public and the private sectors, never the two shall meet, but it's slowly starting to change. And what we are doing with the Ugandan government, with the Ministry of Science and Innovation, is for the first time putting together a climate tech summit that which will result in policies being drafted to create a more enabling environment for climate innovation. And so the players that will be involved in that will be, academics from Harvard, Yale, MIT. We have DFIs coming in from Europe. We have, notable institutional organizations are also coming in. So you see that there is an actual charge on ground, and there's a need and there's a want for this evolution and change.
Okay, great. So you've outlined some of the kind of building blocks that we need to have in place for nature to become investable infrastructure, which is community engagement, working with local communities, working with indigenous leaders as well. I think that has been a big part of the conversation. Working with governments, trying to bridge the gap between governments and the private sector. Raviv, what would you add to that? I think you're very deep in the technology development piece. What are some exciting things that you're seeing from a technological point of view that really enables capital to flow from where it is to where it needs to go?
Yep, so we're seeing some of the members of the Nature Tech Collective, companies that develop eDNA solutions, bioacoustics, smart sticks in the ground that can measure soil, working now together with financial institutions, with banks, with insurance companies to make sure that we can, I say we can treasure what we can measure, right? So establish a baseline and working with those companies also to de-risk greenwashing and making sure that they can do claimable impacts and work with those new technologies to really bring it back to their ESG reports and make sure that they have the data to back it up for their claims. So there's some really new and fascinating technologies that can make investing in nature more affordable. On the financing side, we have a 700 billion.
Can you just give a few examples of the technologies that you're most excited about?
Yes. So eDNA, you can take a drop of water and really map species in an ecosystem and understand what's around you. It doesn't solve for abundance, but at least it can tell you, are you in a sensitive biodiversity hotspot? Or are there any endangered species in the area where you operate and your value chain exists? So you can take care of this. You can also make sourcing decisions and might decide to move your sourcing somewhere else where it's less sensitive for biodiversity. Bioacoustics can listen to birds and start mapping birds. Technologies that can follow migratory birds, for example, around wind turbines, and really give executives decision supports on where to source from and where to build infrastructure in a way that it's less harmful for nature and biodiversity. Technologies that can measure soil and do continuous measurement of soil. There's so much we don't understand yet about soil. And now there is the need to go and take a soil sample, send it to the lab. We're starting to see smart sticks in the grounds that can measure for 13 different soil metrics and measurement and tell you something about the soil, which then tells you something about the food and nutrient density. And of course, we are nature, so all those technologies are connected to our else. So yeah, pretty exciting and fascinating tech development.
Yeah, amazing. And I think that speaks to what I hear a lot of people being concerned about is, okay, well, biodiversity is very complex. It's much more, and it is true that it is much more complex than carbon. There's no one single metric that we can track. And then we're also not just worried about biodiversity, but also water and other kind of like nature-related outcomes. But I think just getting stuck on the fact that we can measure the outcomes is kind of not the right place to stop, and because of all of these new technologies that are being developed really quickly and really tested with a lot of corporate partners as well. So I think there's really rapid progress in this space right now, and hopefully measurement won't be the big worry anymore when we have this conversation again next year, or maybe in 2 years. But since we are almost out of time, I think as kind of a closing question for both of you is, how profitable will investing in nature as infrastructure be, and how profitable should it be, and for whom? So thoughts on that, and how do we get it right?
So how do we get it right? I don't have the exact answer for that, but I will say that investing in nature, I think globally is about $113 billion a year, but it needs to go up significantly more, and that's specific to Africa. And one of the big takeaways I do want to leave everyone here with is not looking at it as a philanthropic endeavor, right? That Africa is not it's not a story that needs to be saved, but rather it's a business opportunity that needs to be seized. So I would frame it in that way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Raviv?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is money to be made investing in nature. I also think we have to be realistic. This came up on the water panel yesterday, where investors are expecting 25%, IRR from investing in water infrastructure. Okay, that doesn't exist. But we've seen double digits, returns, and adjusting these risk-return profiles and thinking of nature as very precious real estate. At the end of the day, we have this thing called the biosphere, and it's 20 kilometers from the ocean bottoms to the mountaintops, and that's where life exists. So that's the most precious real estate that we have. And we are seeing investors investing in timber, in agriculture, in wetlands, in mangroves. So we're starting to see this happening with double-digit returns, and also thinking about return on impact, not just return on finance. And how can we quantify this? How can we quantify ecosystem services and invest in pollination, for example? And then do this in order to mitigate risk. I mean, if there's no biodiversity, there is no pollination. There is no pollination, there is no coffee. There's no coffee, there is no Starbucks. It's as simple as that.
All right, I think that is a great place to end. If you would like to learn more about this, Greenbiz has launched Bloom, our biodiversity event last year. This year we're taking it to Cali in Colombia, and we'll be hosting it alongside COP16. So if you're there and if you want to join us, please scan this QR code and you can request an invitation to dive deeply into this topic for 2 days. All right, so with that, I hope you'll join us in Cali, but for now, join me in thanking Raviv and Nela for being here today. Thank you.
Nice, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Teresa and team. For the penultimate piece of the program today, we are going to get a guide to financing pathways to commercial liftoff. To host this conversation, please join me in welcoming to the stage Greenbiz staff writer and climate policy reporter Leah Garden.
Hello, everyone. Ooh, this is what happens when you have a lot of hair. Welcome, welcome, welcome. For everyone who doesn't know, this is Dr. Vanessa Chang. She's the Chief Commercial Officer for DOE's Office of Technology Transitions. Welcome to GreenFin. Thanks for coming.
Great to be here.
So just to start things off, why don't you give everybody some insight into what the DOE's Office of Technology Transitions does? Let them in on some of the secrets.
Sure. So first of all, I know there's a ton of acronyms people throw at you. So I just want to let you guys know that we call ourselves the Otters, OTT. I know Tom was talking about beavers, but otters are like friendly aquatic animals that create tools that have and are able to help the environment around them. And so think of us as being the folks who are helping to drive the clean energy transition. And really, as a Chief Commercialization Officer for DOE, our mandate is to really figure out how do we bring all these amazing technologies that we have invented in the labs, not just in DOE's 17 national labs, but across the nation, actually into the real world. And so the work that we're doing is to catalyze all the money that we've gotten, $1 trillion from Bill Iron chips, to catalyze that to encourage the private sector to use their money to actually help bring these technologies to life. And so you'll see a theme of commercialization is it's private sector led and government enabled. So how do we use the $1 trillion to buy down risks to the point where the $23 trillion can step in to bring these technologies to the market?
I think everybody here is probably a fan of the $1 trillion.
I'm a bigger fan of the 23 trillion, but I'm a fan of both.
Oh, good point. See, this is why I write, and I'm not a mathematician. So I think something that's really important that we should go into is the liftoff reports, and you are one of the authors of the Department of Energy's liftoff reports. So could you give us a little bit more detail on them and why investors should find them important?
Sure. So here at OTT, we quarterback the liftoff reports, which are basically roadmaps for what it takes to actually bring these clean energy technologies actually to market. As a PhD scientist, I suffered from really just focus on the technology and really trying hard to drive the technology readiness of things. But you can have something work, but it doesn't mean it actually can get to deployment because of unit cost economics and all this other kind of stuff. And so one of the things I was really trying to figure out here at OTT, we try to catalyze ecosystems. So the thing I was trying to figure out is how do you bring the private sector, academia, the startups, all these people together on the same page of what it's going to take to bring these technologies to life. Because there's not one single organization that can do this. And so I was inspired by Semitech when they had created these roadmaps in order to help double number of transistors on a chip. And also by the Manhattan Project, we're able to catalyze the entire nation to do something pretty big, pretty fast. And that is what inspired the liftoff reports, which are basically almost like roadmaps that really has the input from the private sector of what the unit cost economics need to look like. What are the other barriers like permitting or things that are actually preventing these things from taking shape? And so we published 11 liftoff reports, which you can find at liftoff.energy.gov. That's liftoff.energy.gov. And the reason why all of you guys who are doing finance should think about this is we are looking at the risks beyond technology that are preventing these things from actually making it to market. So as people who do finance, you're thinking about what is the risk profile I'm willing to bet against. And this is exactly what we're trying to do, is get everyone on the same page of what needs to happen. And we started with long duration energy storage, nuclear, carbon management, and hydrogen. And if you go to liftoff.energy.gov, you can see the others that we've done. And we are continuously updating these as we get new information. Because what we know now is not going to be right 6 months from now as you learn more. And that's the nature of commercialization. And so that's why I'm super excited about this, is it's really private sector led and government enabled example of how we're doing that.
That's fantastic. So I would imagine that you want investors to look there first as a way to get the first step into the door to get towards that commercialization aspect that DOE's OTT is really working towards. And we know that the commercialization of nascent technology is absolutely vital to the clean energy transition. I don't think anybody here would disagree with that. And we know OTT is like if not the key player in catalyzing all of that happening. So can you go into the role that OTT serves when it comes to de-risking some of this technology as it's on its path to commercialization?
Yeah, sure. So we do have money that we invest in through programs that OTT quarterbacks. One of the things we have is a technology commercialization fund where we're trying to understand how do we move things from development to demonstration and deployment. So if you think about commercialization, it's research to development, demonstration, deployment, the RD&D continuum. And really what we're trying to understand is what is it going to take to move across these phases as efficiently as possible. And so another thing I want to share with all of you is something we created called adoption readiness levels. So everyone is obsessed with TRLs, and many large companies focus on technology stage gates. But as I mentioned earlier, that is not enough to actually drive to deployment. So we created something called adoption readiness levels, which has gone viral because it's something which we use in order to really help especially engineers and PhD trained scientists understand the other things that are required to actually drive things to deployment. And VCs are now using this framework and asking people applying for dollars from them to actually use adoption readiness levels as a way for them to understand the risk profiles that sit within the startups that, or small companies that they're trying to back. And so that's where we really are changing the nature of the language and the thinking to think beyond technology. Technology is super critical, but we have to be able to understand, do the economics make sense, right? Do we have any supply chain constraints we have to worry about? Is there a chicken and egg, which we see in hydrogen, where people are not willing to do demand offtake agreements until they know they have a stable supply chain, but the stable supply chain can't get set up until they have offtake agreements. And this is one of the reasons why when we realized this, there's $8 billion through the IRA and bill that we bill that we had towards hydrogen hubs. We had $7 billion of that go towards the supply chain side of it, and we had 7 hydrogen hubs that we invested in. We reserved $1 billion of it to catalyze offtake agreements. It's the first time ever the federal government had done this, because people don't want to do offtake agreements unless they have a guaranteed price. And the $1 billion is really to help on that side of it. And so these are the kinds of things that we've really been trying to steward and innovate on.
And how does OTT interact, if it does at all, with the rest of DOE's different departments?
Yeah, so the key thing is that, and this is where the otter is very important, because the otter is very collaborative. And in the end, it's something where our budget is actually very modest. And so really where we are able to amplify the impact is by influencing others across DOE to use their money differently. So the $8 billion I talked about actually came from the Office of Clean Energy demonstrations, and they worked with us on the hydrogen liftoff report. We actually did that one kind of jointly in terms of the leadership, and we worked across all of DOE in order to do that. That then became the cornerstone of their funding opportunity announcement for the $7 billion. So everybody who came in had dog-eared copies of the hydrogen liftoff reports, because there we said, here's what you guys need to address if we're actually going to be able to commercialize. And so every single one of these liftoff reports, there are parts of DOE where it's relevant that are actually co-leading it with us, so that we are then using it to influence the money going out the door and the $1 trillion going out the door.
Fantastic. And so OTT is currently in the second round of its EPIC program. EPIC stands for Energy Program for Innovation Clusters, which is essentially an incubator fund. Can you speak more about the EPIC program and where previous tech startups now? And can you talk at all about some of the applicants for the current round too?
That I cannot do, but what I can talk to you about, I know. But one of the things that I will say is startups are so critical and small business are so critical to the growth of the nation and what we're able to do. And one of the things that we know is that companies that are supported by incubator have a 5-year survival rate of 87% versus companies who don't have a 44% survival rate. And then entrepreneurs who actually receive mentorship increase their annual revenue by an average of 83% versus 16%. So if you think about where we want to actually make a mark by scaling, funding incubators, accelerators through EPIC is super, super critical. And the thing that's great is it's not just a mentorship, but they also get a chance to access R&D, prototyping, manufacturing facilities, get a chance to get into the network of supply chains and things like that. And so far, the EPIC program has done really well. We actually just had an EPIC pitch event. It was called the Purple Pitch to honor Prince, or the artist formerly known as Prince, in Minneapolis. And so far, we've made over 80 awards worth $19 million to incubators and some startups in over 30 states in Puerto Rico. And a third of the awards occurred over the last 2 months, which is pretty exciting. So we haven't quite seen the effect. But among the rest, we've supported over 230 startups with the things that we did before then. And so far, our startups have secured $140 million in private and public follow-on funding, 1,900 jobs, and annual revenue about $30 million, which is pretty astounding because the dollar amount that we've had is very, very small. And so one of my favorite examples of a company that has actually used a lot of OTT's programs is a company called Claw Industries, which is based in upstate New York, where these were some University of Rochester students who had a low carbon cement that they really wanted to commercialize. And they had this idea, and they applied to OTT's Energy Technology University Prize, where they won $25,000 and used the money to create a prototype of their sidewalk with their cement. That was then used to apply for an SBIR Phase 2 out of EPA, and they won over $1 million on that. We then put them into one of our incubators in EPIC, where they got a lot of the support and mentorship they needed, and then they were then put forth for an EPIC startup competition where they won $100,000 and actually used it to buy a cement mixer because their cement was not yet qualified and people didn't want it in their trucks. So if you go to upstate New York, you'll see a big yellow cement mixer which has OTT branding on the side of it. which is kind of exciting. But the thing I love is they're about to break ground on a new manufacturing facility. They've already manufactured 50 tons of concrete, which is incredible given the fact that these are students who had just won that $25,000 less than 2 years ago. So really small dollar amounts can catalyze amazing entrepreneurs when the heart and the energy and the economics and all that makes sense.
And if people in our audience want to go and see some of the startups that you just mentioned with the funding, where can they find? Is there a list somewhere?
Yeah, there's a list. We have maps. Like the DOE is all about maps. We're like Dora the Explorer with all kinds of maps. So you can go to Epic and find our Epic maps and click on those and find the incubators.
Wonderful. And we're starting to get to the end of our time. So I think what I really want to ask is, what is the one main takeaway that you really want this specific audience to know about DOE and OTT?
Well, first of all, I want you guys to know that here at the DOE, there's many of us who actually come with a private sector background. And so the DOE is really different now than it was, I would say, even when I started as a day one appointee with Biden. I was talking to you earlier where I've never been this entrepreneurial ever in my life. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, working for the federal government, but when I was interviewing them for the job, I was like, look, I'm someone who moves fast, I hate bureaucracy, and I really want to be able to have an impact. And so I was like, this is not the right job for me. And they're like, no, 90% of what you want to do is what you want to do. 10% there'll be things we need you to do. And they've been true to that. And so we have moved faster than I've ever moved. To give you an example, we started the liftoff reports in September of 2022. And if you read them, they're like very intense analysis. We had them on our website by March of 2023. So 6 months to actually do the really deep analysis on 4 major technology areas and to get White House approval and everything to get that in. That is faster than fast. And that is what is so exciting for me is we are different right now and we really understand the private sector and it's really private sector led, government enabled. And the thing I really want to say is too often people are hesitant where it's kind of like the Squid Games where everyone is first in line to be 4th, 5th, or 6th. No one wants to be first in line to cross that bridge. And, you know, with this money that we have, we are paving the way to help you de-risk things. And an example of the hydrogen hubs is we had $7 billion. We had $40 billion matching coming from the private sector. So the thing I want to say to all of you is stop playing chicken and being really nervous about everything. We don't have time. We really don't. It's kind of like, you know, when you're finishing a big term paper when you were in high school and you're like, I'll just wait, in the very end you have to do the same amount of work but you have less time to do it. It's the same thing with the clean energy transition. The more you guys wait for everyone else to do it, the less time we have. And we really owe it to the next generation to move. So I get it, you guys all have ROIs and things like that you have to think about, but let's be creative around this. Let's think about ways that we can move. Let's use Bill and Ira to actually catalyze these things. And that's really what I want you guys to be thinking about is moving fast. And if you want to know more, we're going to actually have a breakout session at 1:30 p.m. In room 410 where we're going to talk about financing and the things that we're thinking about here at DOE creatively. I think every single person in this room needs to be more creative and less risk averse. And if I can be entrepreneurial in the federal government, I know you guys can be entrepreneurial with your check writing. I really know you guys can do it because we owe it to our family, we owe it to the next generation. And so please don't be risk averse right now. We don't have the time for it. We need to get this planet on the right track.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Great note to end on. Dr. Vanessa Chang.
Thank you.
We're going to go this way.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right on. All right. Thank you, everybody. Mindy Luber, President and CEO of Ceres, and thank you, Ceres, for being our convening partner this year at GreenFin. Mindy, I take it you have been doing this for a while, navigating the disclosure landscape on climate. The Ceres met with the SEC in 2003 for the first time, back when we were at 370-ish parts per million of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Before we get into the pushback and the stays on the rule and why you're trying to take away everybody's hamburger, as you're learning when you get in front of Congress, what is the main win that we should hang on to this year and where we're at in this process of this new era of disclosure?
Well, there are so many wins, and when I sit in your audience and listen to our federal government say, be entrepreneurial, move fast, put more money in, write bigger checks, and that the government's matching it, there's so much going on. I'm going to say one thing that's not related to this talk in specific, and then come back to this talk. But think about the IRA that passed last year. $369 billion to get us to a transformational moment in time, to transform our energy system, our transportation system. $2 trillion in infrastructure money. So if there were a time to move where we have the opportunity to go, and go fast, but go smart, that's the moment in time we're living. So there's a lot of anti-ESG and pushback on this, that, and the other thing. There's also $3 trillion or so out there of smart, innovative carrots to get us to a cleaner energy future that we can all take advantage of.
I love that. On the SEC rule itself, I read before this a recent Bloomberg Law survey of both law firms and in-house counsel showing the majority think the rule will remain partly intact, but a not insignificant portion of the law firms, about 25% or so of respondents, said the rule would be wholly overturned. What should companies in the room be doing, both as corporate issuers and reporters, but also as corporate citizens, to keep this momentum?
Great. So just to back up, we're talking about climate risk disclosure. The SEC passed a rule which is being litigated, debated, stayed, and we could get into the details if we need to. California passed a law that says there ought to be climate risk disclosure. The UK passed a law. The EU, the European Union, passed a comprehensive law, all of which does one thing: calls for the disclosure of material climate risks. Radical idea? I don't think so. The SEC has a job. Their job is to provide information to investors who want to know what are the risks of the companies that we may invest in. Simple as that. Now, it still was a 500-plus page rule. I don't know. It is a simple concept. We ought to disclose risks so investors can make smart decisions, and frankly, so companies know what their risks are and they can act on it. The SEC acted. As I said, that's being litigated. But we're trying to make sure the EU's running far ahead of us, the UK far ahead of us. There are now 20 other jurisdictions about to adopt, just to use more verbiage, ISSB standards, the International Sustainability Board, there's another word in there, that calls for mandatory climate risk disclosure, but they do it in a way where they don't have the authority to mandate it. Simple concept. The fact that there were tens of thousands of comments on the rules show interest in it. It is really time to get on with it. So you ask, what should folks do? I would argue that we need to stand up. Climate risk disclosure is the foundation for so many other things, for climate risk action plans, for moving forward, for all of the things we've talked about so far at this conference. It is time to move on with that. The rest of the world is moving. Companies don't want to have to comply in one country under these rules in another country. And so it is being litigated. There are amicus briefs being filed, many companies coming together, investors coming together to say enough is enough. Let's get the SEC rule implemented. Same thing in California. There's a lawsuit there. It is time to move these things forward as the foundation, the basis for so many other things we're talking about here today.
And the information being provided in this disclosure context we're talking about is meant to be decision useful, comparable, all the rest from the investor lens. And we're moving from this era of disclose emissions, let us know your targets, your ambitions, and now how you're going to get there. The transition plan era has unfolded. How are you seeing transition plans meeting that moment of being decision useful? How are investors from your network finding these to be utilizable tools? How are you watching that all unfold?
Well, they're not all called for in a mandatory way, but this is the year of transition plans, and it must be. We've got, as we all know, thousands, tens of thousands of commitments. I'm going to get to net zero, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, on the part of thousands of companies and investors. And I believe there is an interest. If they come out and set those goals, it's because they believe they could get there. But we have to be in a moment of time where, how are you going to get there? What does that look like? Not in 2037 to meet a 2040 goal, but this has to be the year or a couple of years of writing those transition plans that turn those goals into action plans that are short, medium, and long term, that tell us what you're going to do next year, again, not in 2040, that has accountability, as you say, comparability, and consistent information. We are seeing an enormous number of those transition plans being developed. We put out a little report last week at Series on examples of what a good transition plan looks like. How do you develop one? And not only companies, but investors should do their own transition plans. How are they going to get to the goals that they set out? We know that without a roadmap, and without a roadmap that provides accountability and systems design, and metrics, you don't get there. So time to go out and not only disclose what your risk is from climate, but how you're going to address that risk.
And kind of comparing this, like from the investor lens, the decades of voluntary disclosure, there's great statistics that I can't remember the exactness of, but 90-something% of the S&P 500 disclosing some form of ESG report, Russell 1000. The investor response to a good portion of that is, that's good, and not all of that has been helpful for us to do what we need to do. Are there lessons that can be learned from that couple of decades experience going into this era of transition planning that we can make sure not to repeat a situation where investors find themselves giving that response?
Well, let's start with even just disclosure before we get to transition plans. The most useful thing is consistency, is accountability, is assurance. What the SEC rule calls for is the disclosure of climate risk. And it treats climate risk like any other material risk. It might be currency risk, housing crisis risk. It looks at it for what it is, a business financial risk, and asks investors to disclose it. And do it in a way where, or asks companies to disclose it, and do it in a way where everybody's using the same system and the same design. There's nothing radical about that. Companies for time immemorial have been disclosing to the SEC their material risks. But climate or diversity or equity were externalities. They weren't real risks. They weren't having to be included. All the SEC says is include them if they're material, if they matter to your firm. And the SEC rule also says, and if you have a climate transition plan that's material, include that as well. What we want is uniformity. We don't want, investors don't want to look at 10,000 different designs. And that's the beauty of a mandatory standard and not a voluntary standard. Voluntary standards are good. We've made great progress together. Everybody in this room, I'm sure, has been part of the movement to have voluntary disclosure and sustainability reports. And that's incredible progress. But now let's tighten that up and standardize it and make sure, most importantly, it provides timelines and accountability and transparency.
And maybe from a slightly different lens, from the lens of the corporate sustainability practitioner, there's a sentiment in some thread of that community that, and this is referenced maybe by one of our best read articles on Greenbiz, about sustainability professionals don't want to become carbon accountants or don't want to become accountants, even if they do have superpowers, as Bob Massey outlined yesterday. How do you think about that sentiment of, like, disclosure is essential? I'm sure most people in the room will agree more information is better than less, but we're not going to disclose our way to a sustainable outcome. How do you think about that bandwidth polling within the industry of actual practitioners in sustainability?
So I'm all for that. Let's get past this. Let's disclose the major issues that we disclose, companies disclose on anything and everything that's material. But it is just about disclosure, and we're all about here, action, changing. How do we get to the goalposts? We could not have heard better presentations about the risks we're facing and the threats to our ecosystems, nature, our business, our economy, frankly, our kids and our kids' future. And disclosure is merely the platform, and frankly, it's tragic that we are still talking about it. We talked about it 20 years ago, then it was time to act, certainly 10 years ago. Disclosure just provides some information. And sustainability professionals who don't want to be accountants, I'm with them. We need their creativity, their genius, their knowledge of the firms that they work at or that you all work at, and how to be clever and creative about changing the systems, using different cement, different steel, different systems, use less water. There are dozens of things that could be done. That's where we want to put our attention. So, important to talk about disclosure because there is so much going on, but let's not lose sight of where we need to go and the fact that disclosure is merely a fundamental building block that I don't want to discount. It's exceedingly important, and that's why I've seen 25,000 comments on the SEC rule, but it really is only the base. What we've got to be doing is designing the systems that get us to bringing those greenhouse gas emissions down.
And these rules are around disclosure are part of the broader policy enabling environment for sustainability to succeed that we've heard a little bit about across the different sessions today and yesterday. But on the policy front, yeah, so Ceres does a good job of tracking ESG-related shareholder proposal topics. Transition plans saw a lot of growth this year, so did policy footprints, policy lobbying, information, political lobbying. What, both either tied to disclosure rules or just more broadly the policy enabling environment, what does it look like, or what does good look like as a corporate citizen in that sense in terms of policy lobbying and engagement?
Well, I'll say two things about that. The first thing I'll say is, if you're at an enterprise, small, medium, and large business, investor, and you've got a plan, a position, we're going to get to net zero by X, or we're going to build out a transition plan, but your government affairs office is still lobbying for the wrong bills, for things that go against the future on climate transition. Or if your trade associations and professional associations, be it the Chamber of Commerce or any other, are still fighting the kind of progressive legislation that you believe in and support, that's a problem. So how do you literally go into the complete firm, if you're at a large investment house, a large business, and make sure that there's alignment? Because it is not okay anymore in the year 2004 or 24 to say, we're going to get to that clean energy future, and we're going to use different resources, and we're going to work with our supply chain, but we're going to get there. If, in fact, the professional associations that you're part of are opposing the things that get us there. We have got to have consistency. Only you all, within your enterprises, can make sure of that. We don't have laws that mandate it. Consistency is crucial. But let me say one other thing. There is this movement out there that we're all facing one way or another, this anti-ESG, woke capitalism. I'm not even sure what woke capitalism means, and I've been in this space for a good long while. What I know is the narrative is being taken away from us. The narrative is, if you come together and work together, it's antitrust. Or if you're working on climate-related issues, you are depriving the American public of good, cheap energy that they need. Those things are not the case. They do not add up. But it is up to each and every one of us in our state, in our federal discussions, within our own enterprises, to stand up and change that narrative. We are talking about something that will change the course of our future unlike anything we have ever seen. And for people to nitpick and change the narrative and try and suggest that there is something wrong with looking at the scientific imperative of acting, the human imperative of acting, the financial imperative of acting, when the consequences are so catastrophic, just does not make any sense. But we're living in a crazy political time. This ought not to be political. This is about our kids' future, the future of our economy, and each and every one of us need to be part of standing up and changing that narrative. I am depending on everyone in this room to do that. I'm doing my part. We've got a major challenge out there, but we've got extraordinary opportunities for change, and I look forward to taking on all of those with you.
Thank you so much for doing your major part in this, and I think that's a perfect place for us to leave it today.
Great.
Thank you, Mindy,
Well,
for
thank
joining
you.
us. Join me in thanking Mindy. All right. Thanks, Mindy. See you later. All right, and that is the end of today's keynote program. You have got some wonderful roundtable lunches waiting for you next up. Please share your experience on your social media of choice with hashtag GreenFin24. Enjoy the rest of the conference and look forward to meeting more of you later on in the hallways.
The main stage program here at GreenFin 24, but it's the beginning of our second day of exclusive interviews on the live stream at Sidebar. I'm Sarah Golden, I'm VP of Climate Tech, and I am also the Executive Director of our Verge event, and I'm joined by my co-host.
I'm John Davies, President of Trellis Networks. Sarah, what did you like this morning on the main stage?
I mean, I love Tom Chi. I love the way his mind works. I love how he talks about things. It just sounds so obvious when he talks about the way that we've aligned capital with things that we don't actually really want in the world. The whole comparison of an entire carbon sequestration plant and the billions in investment within that being the equivalent sequestration of 20 beavers, I think is a very stark comparison and also an interesting conversion. How about you?
I think it was 200 beavers, but still not a lot of beavers.
Right, okay,
So,
yeah. Small number of beavers, yeah.
Well, I've known Mindy for 20 years, and I just think she is so persistent at getting things right, and it's just really great. I don't think we have a chance for a victory lap or anything, but a lot of the things that Ceres has promoted in the past has come to pass.
I agree, and I also love the way Mindy focuses on making language accessible. She has this one line of, we're not going to be able to transform the world if we're all using our own secret language, and I feel like way too often when we're talking in these financial conversations, it feels limiting.
Yeah.
So we're about to get started with some of these interviews, but first we have a couple of ads. So yeah, let's get over to that, and then we will have a lineup of interviews at the Sidebar. Stay tuned.
Our mission is to modernize and decarbonize old, outdated buildings. We've developed a way so all the ducts, the pipes, the wiring is all integrated into a new facade.
For any tenant who can actually have that type of renovation with minimal intervention inside the apartment, it's huge.
When somebody sees that you got support from Wells Fargo, it brings a lot of validation that's of huge value to the company to see this big investment that just got made in your community. It can be a symbol of hope and optimism.
Like natural, I don't care.
And we're back. I'm sitting here with Betty Huber, who is a partner of Global ESG and co-chair of Latham & Watkins. Betty, so nice to have you here at the Sidebar. So, tell me a little bit about your practice and what you do.
Great, thanks so much. I'm Betty Huber, as was mentioned, and one of the global co-chairs of the environmental, social, and governance practice at Latham & Watkins. Latham is an international law firm. We've got offices in 30 cities around the world, which allows us to provide the global reach to all of our clients now that ESG and sustainability is a global conversation. I've practiced law for over 25 years, started as a corporate and environmental lawyer and eased into the social and the governance aspects of it. So we represent at Latham public companies, financial institutions, insurance companies, their boards, as well as what we'll probably talk about during the Sidebar, private capital providers, whether that be debt, equity, infrastructure, and all of the above.
Yeah, so it's been such a wild ride for ESG. So what trends are you seeing in ESG, especially within the private markets?
Yeah, many different trends. So I'm not even sure where to begin, but I think just generally speaking, in the last keynote, there was a mention about this like anti-ESG woke thing. Despite all of that, ESG continues to be top of mind for all of our clients, particularly our private capital providers. And so it comes in a variety of different ways. You can think of it from the fundraising perspective. It has always been key from day one when you've got certain pension funds who are have exclusions in ESG, require certain terms from a private ordering perspective. And then also in the deal-making perspective, due diligence is a topic that we are spending so much of our time on. Every single private capital provider has different requirements on due diligence, kind of doing that diligence with different targets, ones that are not familiar with what ESG is, or some that are extremely sophisticated and familiar. It runs the gamut completely. And then also, I think, very importantly, is always about value creation. Why are we doing diligence? Why are investments being made? And so you see a lot of different like impact investing going on. So we're raising a lot for our clients, so-called Article 8 and Article 9 funds under the European Union Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which came into effect a couple of years ago, but increasingly difficult disclosure requirements for all of our clients. And navigating all of that in a seamless, efficient, and user-friendly way is really what we spend a lot of our time on. Also, in addition to due diligence, there's always a contract, right? If you're buying and selling in an M&A deal, there's going to be a purchase agreement. We've been spending a lot of time focusing on what is the state of the art in these agreements. Are there representations and warranties on ESG? Is there representations and warranties insurance coverage for ESG matters? Are there covenants that you can ask for? And we talk about ESG and sustainability, but let's break that down a little bit and talk about what exactly that is. So that could be climate change issues. If it's a climate tech investing fund, that's going to be top of mind. However, if the investment involves, let's just say, fashion, supply chain is going to be a big issue. Where is this coming from? Is child labor or forced labor being used? How do you track that supply chain? So human rights has become a huge topic in 2024. Maybe in 2019 it was climate change and people cared about that and then their own workforce. But now it's extending and recognizing that there are global supply chains, whether from your business partners that you contract with upstream or downstream, your consumers. What are they doing? What is their greenhouse gas footprint looking like? So this is extremely complex, and to be able to work on this in every single deal in a way that is understandable and comprehensible and also just responsive to private capital providers' needs is really what we're spending a lot of our time on right now. I can go on and on, but if you've got other questions, we can go into those questions if you like.
Yeah,
Sarah.
it is so complex. There's so many directions we could take this. What ESG criteria are you seeing as making the most amount of difference in impact and in investment decisions? Are there any that are bubbling to the top?
When you mean criteria, are you talking about disclosure regimes, or are you talking about ESG raters, or actually, I guess, bespoke criteria that I guess a particular buyer or sponsor would create for themselves?
Oh, well, I was thinking about what topics and issues are driving the most impact, but those are all, that's whichever direction you'd like to take that.
Yeah, well, you know what, that's a great question, because when you think about it, it is a fundamental question. I think what you're getting at, too, is, well, what is material? So I suppose, like, in a tech deal, you're not going to be thinking about manufacturing type issues and wastewater or pollution. That's really not the key. However, in a manufacturing deal, that would be the case. But in tech, it would be cybersecurity or something. So what is material or significant? And oftentimes, maybe I'll give a plug. I used to be on the advisory council for the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And so SASB, which everyone probably who's watching is familiar with that acronym, came up with a variety of different standards and frameworks for different industries based on industry classification codes. So I would say that would be a good place to start for a sponsor or a company that has no sort of bearing and doesn't have a particular set of topics that they need to cover in every single transaction.
And you mentioned before about some of the regulatory guardrails that are emerging, especially in lines of in disclosures. And I'm curious of how these different regulatory changes are influencing ESG investing strategies.
Oh, That's really interesting. So it's sort of like the convergence of, I would call it private ordering and finally regulation. So as I said, I started practicing law over 25 years ago, and at that time, sustainability wasn't a thing, right? ESG wasn't a thing. And now ESG, pretty much everyone knows what that acronym means and has actual strong feelings one way or the other, or no, or in the middle about it. So really what we're seeing now is this convergence of all of these kind of private standards that I talked about. So I talked about SASB, and I know here this acronym are not going to be a problem. So TCFD, GRI, all of these different reporting standards, all of our clients, mainly public companies and also private equity, have been disclosing against. And now there's this reckoning saying, well, we've got all of this disclosure out there. How do we figure out if this actually comports with what now we're required to disclose under the European Union Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, under the SEC's climate rules, which of course are stayed now, but still out there, and something that could actually take effect depending on how the litigation goes. And then you've got a swathe of regulations and laws in California requiring disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions and climate-related financial risk, as well as disclosures relating to any significant claims of greenhouse gas emissions reductions and the use, purchase, sale, or marketing of carbon offsets, which we haven't even talked about yet. So a whole, host of regulations that corporates and private equity sponsors need to be thinking about, and also taking a look at their disclosures and saying, okay, what's the gap analysis here? And what is material? Are people going to find this information that we're putting out decision useful? Are they really reading this? What do people really care about? What do my investors and stakeholders really care about? And that's the conversation we're having right now.
It is so interesting hearing you talk about that. It feels like such a complex mix of where the regulation is at and where it could potentially go and what's happening within the regulation. Is that uncertainty something that's difficult for your clients to navigate? And I recognize we only have like 10 seconds left.
Oh, goodness.
So
you nailed it. So it's regulatory uncertainty. And so as a lawyer, that's the one thing that we can help kind of see through and cut through all of the noise and say, all right, here's where there is overlap. Here's where there's fragmentation. Let's prioritize what you need to do in the moments that remain.
Well, Betty, thank you so much for joining me here today and for your work on this issue.
Thank you so much. It was great to be with you.
Indeed.
Thanks.
Our mission is to modernize and decarbonize old, outdated buildings. We've developed a way so all the ducts, the pipes, the wiring is all integrated into a new facade.
For any tenant who can actually have that type of renovation with minimal intervention inside the apartment, it's huge.
When somebody sees that you got support from Wells Fargo, it brings a lot of validation that's of huge value to the company to see this big investment that just got made in your community. It can be a symbol of hope and optimism.
I'm joined here by Jacqueline Bouchard, who is EVP of ESG at Solutions and Corporate Responsibilities at Preqin. Apologies, that's a lot of letters to say.
We do love an alphabet soup here, don't we?
Well, thank you so much for joining me here today. So I'd love to ask you about the past, present, and future of ESG data in private markets. What's going on with that?
Well, thankfully, a lot is going on, but I would say it's come quite a long way even in the past 2 to 3 years that I've been in these markets. I think important really just to ground set is that alternatives, private markets are, well, private, so they're inherently opaque. So even financial data, let alone non-financial ESG data, can sometimes be hard to come by. However, again, in the past 2-3 years, we've really seen many more of the market players come forward almost proactively with data, whether it be because they see it as a differentiator, because they're being regulated now, or because quite literally they are now a private market impact investor. We're really seeing it come along to to almost the path that public markets has been on for quite some time. So I'd say it's looking up, and transparency is definitely on the rise.
Yeah, and how are you seeing this evolution of ESG, like integration within investment strategies in a more systemic or fundamental way instead of just sort of an add-on?
Yeah, it's again, I think it's really on the up and up. We work with GPs who are fundraising, and more we're being asked for information about the LPs they're trying to fundraise from. They want to know, are they members of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance? They want to know, do they have any specific investment criteria in their mandates? It's getting more and more specific, really.
And sorry, just to clarify that, you're talking about the LPs of the investment firms are wondering that about where they're investing?
So the GPs who are looking to attract LPs are trying to figure out the LPs, how advanced they are on ESG, what they might require from a GP should they take the money, or really trying to matchmake and find an LP that is at the same level as them in sustainability. And so they want to know that. And then on the flip side, for the LPs, when they're doing their fund manager sourcing, their early diligence, more and more ESG about that fund manager is being embedded into that practice. So does the fund manager have policies at their firm? Do they embed ESG into how they source and allocate their capital? And do they mandate that their portfolio companies track and report data? So again, it's becoming more and more part of the standard decision-making process, because we're seeing the value really after investment and then exit, specifically in this space.
Yeah, and it's great that this is becoming a criteria where they're asking these things and wanting better transparency and seeing what's going on. Are you seeing this really swaying where investments are also? Is it becoming a true criteria that may be weighted against what returns may be as well? Are people willing to take a little bit less in returns?
I would say the majority probably are not, but I think the same can be said for public markets. However, I think something that we're seeing, because now we're able to actually track the financial performance of sustainability or ESG labeled funds. We actually just released research that shows that these funds perform at or above standard funds. So I guess to say it doesn't matter because we don't need to take loss, right? It is still good investing. There are those impact investors where it's their reason for existence, and they're really just looking for those positive externalities maybe at the cost of returns. But I think the mainstream really is that you don't need to have it at the cost of returns. It is good investing.
That's great to hear, because I remember when the ESG funds first came out, it showed that they were performing above, and then there was a moment where it's like, wait, maybe they're not actually performing above. Yeah. But your research shows that you're not needing to compromise. Yes. Asking about these things is actually the smart investment decision as well.
We're seeing fewer swings, highs and lows, so at or above, and so it's good investing.
Yeah. Well, okay, so tell me a little bit about the power of ESG within private markets.
Yes, I think this is something that, as someone who's started in public markets, really excites me, because something really unique to private markets. First of all, this is where all the big ideas start, right? The clean techs, the climate techs, the early seed investing, the ideas that can change the future quicker than, let's say, a standard corporate looking to change the way they currently operate today versus a new idea. But second of all, in private equity, you are a whole or majority owner, and you hold the company for 7, 10 plus years. So if you want to make a change, you do it. Right? You don't have to ask anyone else, really. So there's just so much power in these investments in private equity that I think is something really exciting. And I think to meet our climate goals, to really do anything in these markets, you need to bring private alternative markets along with you. And I think there's a lot of power there.
Well, Jacqueline Bouchard, thank you for your work, and thanks for joining me today at the Sidebar.
Thank you.
Our mission is to modernize and decarbonize old, outdated buildings. We've developed a way so all the ducts, the pipes, the wiring is all integrated into a new facade.
For any tenant who can actually have that type of renovation with minimal intervention inside the apartment, it's huge.
When somebody sees that you got support from Wells Fargo, it brings a lot of validation that's of huge value to the company to see this big investment that just got made in your community. It can be a symbol of hope and optimism.
And we're back, and I am here with Shrinal Sheth from Deutsche Bank. Shrinal, let's start off just, what is your role at Deutsche Bank?
Absolutely, thank you for having me. So at Deutsche Bank, I am the ESG advisory lead for Europe, Middle East, and Africa for our equity capital markets and mergers and acquisitions business. So what that means is whenever there is a transaction, an IPO, a private placement, or an M&A that has an ESG element to it, it will hit my team's desk, and we will kind of help our clients go through an ESG exit preparation plan. We will work with them to think about what's your ESG strategy. Do you have the relevant funding in place? Do you have the right capital expenditure plans? Do you have the right reporting? Are you speaking to the right ESG investors? Are you going to be able to attract that capital when your stock hits the market and therefore get some form of value for your ESG efforts?
So obviously, a lot of private equity will be spinning out companies or selling companies or acquiring companies, right? Are you involved in those kind of transactions as well?
Absolutely. So a lot of the business that we do is with financial sponsors. So typically we would be working with private equity firms who may have a portfolio of X number of companies. We start working with one, and then we'll get involved perhaps with multiple companies as well, depending on what the exit timeline is. Ideally, we like to get involved kind of 18 to 24 months before exit, because then we can really have some form of an impact, both from a financing standpoint, but then also just helping them figure out exactly what they're doing as part of the process for exit.
So obviously there's a lot of upcoming regulation, right, both in Europe and in California and the SEC. But beyond just meeting the compliance side of things, what's the conversation with, 18, 24 months out as you're trying to prepare this prepare a company for an acquisition?
I think that really comes down to two things. One is, where is the company trying to list, for instance, or what type of buyers it may be targeting if it's an M&A situation. And then two is, what sector is the company in? If it is a more, I would say, risk-focused sector, so a gaming company or a defense company, the conversation is going to be very different compared to if it's a clean tech company or if it's an industrial company or a logistics company. So that kind of determines what conversations we have. In the first instance, it's very much focused on how do you make sure that you're not greenwashing? What are the key things that investors want to see or don't want to see potentially as well as red flags as part of your listing or as part of the acquisition? But I think it's more interesting on the value side of things, because then we're trying to figure out, if it is a logistics business, for instance, what is the commitment towards sustainable aviation fuels or biofuels? What does the pricing look like? And how can we maybe work with the company to finance some of those things as well as they prepare for whatever the exit may be? And a lot of the times it is a dual track process, so it will be an IPO, but it could also be an M&A. So we're working with companies at that 18-24 month level to make sure that we can optimize their performance for both routes, because the markets can change anytime, so we want to make sure that our clients are prepared.
And we've been talking a lot, and you've implied a lot on environmental and social, but governance is really huge when it comes to this. So are you also working with those clients on setting up the proper governance, because it's a big thing to go on an IPO?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, yesterday on the panel, I was saying the same thing. The most important thing in an IPO is for the IPO to actually happen. there are so many IPOs that get pulled off the market, and it's oftentimes because of governance reasons. Sometimes it's because of environmental or social reasons as well. But we do work with our clients to focus on governance aspects. It really comes down to what is the reporting requirement or what is the governance structure requirement, both the country and because I do have a focus on Europe and Middle East in those specific regions, because European Union might have its own requirements when you set up the governance structure. But corporate governance has been a part of the IPO or M&A process from the very beginning. So the new piece, so to speak, is the environmental and social piece, and that's where I think we have to do more of an education, because on the governance side, companies are just naturally very aware that they may have to make certain changes.
Okay, we're getting close to the end, but what's your one tip for a founder or a startup in terms of what they need to get ready for if they're going for an IPO or acquisition?
I think two things. One is to start early, to start preparing your ESG strategy very early on, and two is to always have a dedicated person who can speak to your ESG strategy, to your commitments, and most importantly, to the sustainability aspects of your products when you are hitting the market, because that's going to make all the difference when you're having the right investor conversations.
All right, thanks. I've been here with Shunal Sheth. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Davis.
Our mission is to modernize and decarbonize old, outdated buildings. We've developed a way so all the ducts, the pipes, the wiring is all integrated into a new facade.
For any tenant who can actually have that type of renovation with minimal intervention inside the apartment, it's huge.
When somebody sees that you got support from Wells Fargo, it brings a lot of validation that's of huge value to the company. To see this big investment that just got made in your community, it can be a symbol of hope and optimism.
Welcome back. I'm here with Stephanie Wetter from the National Pork Board. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you.
So first things, let's just find out what your role is. What do you do there?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I work for National Pork Board, and there I am the Director of Animal Welfare on our sustainability team. The National Pork Board has been charged through USDA to provide research, promotion, and education to our U.S. pork producers. So through that, primarily, I work through research and education to further animal welfare and sustainability in the U.S. pork industry.
Great. So you can educate me on what's going on at pork farms in America, especially when it comes to sustainability.
Yeah, so there's been a lot going on actually on pork farms. I've been with Pork Board about 6 years, and I've truly seen our shift into sustainability, and for me it's been really exciting. Personally, I have a background in pork production, and so for us to be able to take this deep dive into sustainability has been really fun. So when we're talking about sustainability in the pork industry, we're talking about our 6 We Care ethical principles, which have laid the foundation for our sustainability platform. So we're not looking just at environment, it's a much more holistic definition. So we're looking at environment, animal welfare, which is my area of focus. We're looking at our communities, our people. We're looking at public health, and of course, food safety as well. So we're working with them to build out a new platform, working with our consultants, our professional consultants in sustainability called EOC, an environmental group, with our producers to develop on-farm reports to help our U.S. pork producers measure, monitor, and report the sustainability metrics and efforts that they're doing on their farm.
Great. You know, a lot of times when it comes to agriculture and farming, you know, there's this perception that, you know, it's going to cost too much for the farmers to go green, and so they're resistant and they don't want to do anything that their clients want or anything. Is any of that ring true?
The pork sector has seen a lot of financial troubles over the last few years, truly just due to markets and high input cost. So for about the last year and a half, our pork producers have been losing money with every pig that they've sold. So it truly has been a struggle to implement some of these often expensive changes towards sustainability. That's why we at National Pork Board, there to support our producers, are working with them to help them find funding. So for example, Pork Board is funding those on-farm environmental reports that we just talked about. We've also worked with USDA to obtain part of their $3.1 billion in climate smart grants to support some of these sustainability changes that they're seeing on farms. We're also partnering with other groups like Nest Trade to obtain some grants to very specifically make some changes within their own supply chain supply shed, to make some changes that are going to do things like reduce greenhouse gases, reduce the energy use on farm, and then make some other changes even in the fields that are associated with pig production, so the crops, increasing no-till and cover crops.
Awesome. So what's the most misunderstood thing about the pork industry?
Yeah, oh man, in my world, there's so many misconceptions, right, about what we do on farm. Probably the biggest thing is that pork production is dirty and working with pigs is dirty. Pigs are actually very clean animals, and we're actually very efficient. And so farmers over the years have truly been the pioneers in sustainability. We just called it efficiency, not sustainability. So we've done so much already within the scope of the farm to become sustainable. That's really why we need to look outside of the farm, look more to the crop side, into the feed input side for us, into our inputs to achieve those big gains in sustainability.
That's great. So what brings you joy in your role at the Pork Board?
Honestly, it's helping producers. I did not grow up in the pork industry. I found it when I was in college and truly fell in love both with working with the animals and with working with our pig farmers. So having an opportunity where I can work in the association, I can represent those farmers, I know what they're doing on farm, and I can come up and I can have that conversation and represent the good work that they're doing, that really fulfills me.
That is so awesome. It's exciting work that you're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, we love it.
All right. Well, let's see. Wrapping up, I don't know. What's your one thing you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, so today we're here to talk to the financial sector and investors, right? So when we're talking about sustainability in the pork industry, we talk a lot about the partnerships that are so exciting and are really helping our producers go that extra mile. So we're talking about what are the partnerships that are going to be most beneficial, and why would animal agriculture specifically be a good option for investors and for those to keep investing in this way. So we've done we've come miles really in sustainability in the measuring, monitoring, and reporting that we're doing on farm and in agriculture. Pork Board is starting with the producers, but we're also working further down the supply chain. So working with food service and retail, our big groups like McDonald's, right, to help throughout that supply chain, make those connections, make those links in that chain for sustainability to understand the full concept and the full scope of sustainability and those metrics for that final product, right? So if we're talking about McDonald's, what is the true sustainability impact for the bacon, the sausage, the McRib sandwich, right?
Yeah.
When we're talking about that. So really we're talking about these connections, we're talking about why we're a good investment, and yeah, all the opportunities that we have within animal agriculture.
Fantastic. So I've been here with Stephanie Wetter with National Pork Board. Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you.
Our mission is to modernize and decarbonize old, outdated buildings. We've developed a way so all the ducts, the pipes, the wiring is all integrated into a new facade.
For any tenant who can actually have that type of renovation with minimal intervention inside the apartment, it's huge.
When somebody sees that you got support from Wells Fargo, it brings a lot of validation that's of huge value to the company to see this big investment that just got made in your community. It can be a symbol of hope and optimism.
Welcome back. I'm here with Deloitte's Jonathan Schuldenfrei. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, Jonathan, tell our audience about what you do at Deloitte.
Yeah, sure. So I am part of the leadership team for sustainability, climate, and equity. More specifically, I advise clients on their path to net zero strategies and help them operate in a low-carbon economy.
And I'm sure some of that has to do with decarbonization. So,
absolutely.
What are you doing with clients around decarbonization?
Sure. For FSI clients specifically, I'm working with a few. One is really looking to reduce their carbon footprint, and they're looking to Deloitte to help them devise a strategy to reduce their carbon emissions overall from scopes 1, 2, and 3, including financed emissions. Another client is looking for reporting leading practices and ultimately looking for Deloitte to help implement controls for their ESG report. And then the last client that I'm working with is to help their own portfolio companies with interventions, and they look to Deloitte to help them develop a playbook for those companies to figure out ways to decarbonize their own businesses, and in turn that would positively impact or negatively reduce the carbon emissions for financed emissions for that financial services company.
So, you know, you've sort of mentioned three big areas there. So in that first area, what are the types of things you're looking at for companies that are looking at reducing across scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? What are the things that stand out that you look at for a company like that?
Yeah, great question. For the financial services company, predominantly, they have a large real estate portfolio, not only from an investment perspective, but their direct emissions from a scope 1 perspective. So identifying opportunities for energy management, energy procurement, building operation optimization and reduction are big levers. Depending on whether they have fleet or not, that could also be a lever. So that's predominantly scope 1, and then scope 2 is their energy management, again, in terms of what could they potentially procure a renewable energy portfolio, could they do on-site, could they install solar, could they identify VPPA contracts, virtual purchase power agreements, where they could potentially offload their brown electrons to green electrons, whether through that off-site work or through virtual work. And then for scope 3, it depends on where the relevancy is in terms of the categories, but I would say that financed emissions is the lion's share of that, and I believe that a lot of these financial services companies are starting to integrate some of their risk management strategies with their decarbonization strategies, so they can start having a conversation with some of their counterparts in lines of businesses in ways that they would understand. So for example, they could talk about the trade-off of net interest margin and the decarbonization. What is the risk of that particular portfolio or that asset class based on the exposure to carbon? And they can start treating it like a duration risk rather than just a conversation.
So, yeah, it's interesting. You talk about risk, but I'm sure that a lot of your work is also about the opportunity that comes out of this. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. I have a client that was working on how they could potentially discuss the fact that they do not require cold chain, and that their carbon emission footprint is greatly reduced as a result of that, and all of their competitors do require cold chain. So the absence of that carbon emissions allowed them to have a positive impact in terms of their product. And then obviously there's LCAs that I perform for other clients where they're looking to identify the material extraction, the assembly production, the logistics, and then the end of life. So when we work with our clients through the LCA process, that's also an area that we're making positive impacts so that they can find opportunities to enhance their products or decarbonize their products in their value chains.
Oh, that is tremendous. You know, so I've been talking with Jonathan Schuldenfrei from Deloitte. Thanks a lot, Jonathan.
Thanks, David. It was great.
Our mission is to modernize and decarbonize old, outdated buildings. We've developed a way so all the ducts, the pipes, the wiring is all integrated into a new facade.
For any tenant who can actually have that type of renovation with minimal intervention inside the apartment, it's huge.
When somebody sees that you got support from Wells Fargo, it brings a lot of validation that's of huge value to the company. To see this big investment that just got made in your community, it can be a symbol of hope and optimism.
Welcome back to the GreenFin live stream. What do you think, Sarah? How'd it go?
I really enjoyed the conversations today. I enjoy everything that has sense making for all these complex financial systems. And so both the keynotes and all of the conversations here were fantastic. How about you?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I got to talk with someone from the National Pork Board. So how does it get any better than that?
Yeah, and I guess that's the end of this live stream, and until the next event that we have at Greenbiz.
Well, Sarah, speaking of next events, you're up next with Verge. So
I know, there's always this time at Greenbiz. We have these different cycles, and there's this time when the last event ends, and then the next one up is my event, that it feels like it's really go time. And that event is Verge, which will be October 29th through 31st at the San Jose Convention Center. That event really focuses on deploying climate tech at scale. And so we bring together a lot of the major corporations, companies, the stakeholders that are working to figure out how to really incorporate climate tech within operations to lead to decarbonization. So mark your calendars.
What better way to spend Halloween than talking about climate tech? Yeah.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, it's our largest event. We're expecting over 6,000 people there this year, and it's also we focus on all of these different sectors and have different ways for the people that are working in those sectors to work cross-sectorally, but then also get deep within the work that they are working on right now to learn from the peers that are like the early trailblazers. So I'm sure it will be adequately spooky for Halloween.
Well, I think what's great is the intersection going from finance, where you're financing all of this great work, to what's the work happening on the ground. So, until we meet you at Verge in a few months, I think that's it for us. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, John.